A total of 12 million more. Now, each of our gun companies has already ponied up $4 million into this sportsman's legacy fund. Now, that may not seem like a hell of a lot of money where you come from, but we think $20 million ought to be enough to secure a jury in the People's Republic of Berkeley, California, let alone here.
How about 30,000?
30,000, what are you talking about?
It's an interesting amount to reflect on. The number of gun deaths every year. Well, the number of men, women, and children who are disabled by your gentleman's products last year alone. 100,000. Or we could focus on the number 1. Because 1 is all they want. 1 win, 1 precedent. Because once they get that, they're going to be traveling around this country filing civil actions and siphoning away at that $2 billion you gentlemen sell in firearms and ammo every fiscal year. $2 billion! Woo! Where I come from, that's a lot of money. What I'm asking for is a pittance compared to what a negative verdict is going to cost you.
My share price is down 25% just on word of this trial.
I'm down almost 30.
Well, I'll kick in an extra 1.5, but no mas.
1.5 each, that's 7.5 total.
Well, I'll take it.
You have any additional plans for this pittance?
Matter of fact, I do.
Lonnie Shaver, manager here?
All day?
Ernie Strode.
I'm going to put you gentlemen in the grocery business.
Grocery business.
We're in the process of acquiring your store.
Meeting with all the store managers to discuss their future roles in the organization.
Poor bastard hasn't had a promotion in 5 years.
Not all employees are going to make the transition.
We've identified you as one of our candidates for the Superhouse program.
How soon can we fly you up?
Mr. Shaver, in subtle and unspoken ways, we made to appreciate the terms of advancement in the Hammond Foods empire.
I don't like the looks of this one.
Ex-Marine drill instructor. These people are looking for a leader. They'll follow Frank Herrera.
And if they elect someone else for me?
Whoever they vote for will be following me, just like in Cincinnati and Oakland and Pittsburgh. Gentlemen, trials are too important to be left up to juries.
That's right. So I'm going to show you how to understand basic law so that we're more informed when we go to participate in the jury trial, or if you have to litigate your own case or have an understanding of how attorneys work. This is basic tort law.
Now let's turn to equal protection of the laws. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment says that no state shall deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. Now, who exactly is protected? Well, all persons, including corporations and non-citizens, are protected. And against whom is the clause applied? Well, because it appears in the 14th Amendment, it protects against state and local denials of equal protection. But in terms of the federal government, although there's no explicit, no specific equal protection clause applicable to the federal government in the Bill of Rights, the Equal Protection Clause has been read into the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment in the Bill of Rights. And I've even seen some reference to this by judges as being a form of reverse absorption. Just like the Due Process Clause of the 14th incorporates the Bill of Rights against the states, so the Due Process of the Fifth, by reverse absorption, incorporates the Equal Protection Clause against the federal government. But however you describe this, it means that, technically speaking, if the federal government, let's say, is denying equal protection by racial discrimination, you would argue that the federal government is violating the equal protection component of the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. All right, what do we mean by equal protection? What is this a guarantee of? Well, we know that all laws can't apply equally to everybody all the time. In fact, if we had such a rule, such a general equality rule, there would be no legislation, because inevitably legislation has to treat people differently, to classify them on some basis. For example, if the legislature decides that people can't drive cars until they're a certain age, that's a classification, a discrimination. Some who are of a certain age can drive, and those who are not of the certain age cannot drive. And in general, when the government does this sort of thing, treating people differently and making those kinds of distinctions in the law, we don't worry too much about violations of equal protection. We assume that that's part of the process of legislation. What then does equal protection protect? Well, first, it protects us against arbitrariness. And so if the government draws classifications, you can drive at one age but not at another, you can go into certain businesses for so many hours, but you can't carry on that business after noon or after midnight, any kinds of classifications like that. With respect to those, there has to be at least some basis. The law and the distinction that it draws cannot be completely arbitrary and crazy. But that's a very, very lenient test, and it's akin to the rational basis test we've already seen under substantive due process. And pretty much, as you'll see, to invoke that rational basis test is to basically uphold the law and uphold the distinctions that the legislature has drawn. And in general, we can say, when the government treats people differently, based upon ordinary economic, social, and general welfare criteria, it will be judged under this lenient rational basis test and upheld. However, in addition to protecting us against arbitrariness, which is obviously a very, very tiny, itsy-bitsy kind of a protection, the court has identified 5 bases of different treatment that will be judged more severely under either what we call strict scrutiny or intermediate or mid-level scrutiny. Now, these 5 classifications are discrimination on the basis of race or ethnic origin, discrimination based upon alienage, not being a citizen, discrimination based on gender, discrimination based upon illegitimacy, by which I mean a person whose parents weren't married when they were born, and finally discrimination based on the exercise of a fundamental right. Now, when you have these 5 bases of classification used by the government, these 5 bases of treating people differently, the rational basis doesn't apply, and instead we apply something far more rigorous. Now, before we get to looking particularly at those bases of classification, we have already learned one thing, which I want to discuss now. Obviously, it's going to matter very much for equal protection purposes. What basis does a law classify? On what basis does a law classify? So, in equal protection, we have to first ask frequently, how do we know on what basis a law is actually classifying? Is it classifying based upon income? Is it classifying based upon age? Is it classifying based upon race? Because as I said, given the structure of equal protection doctrine, if the government is classifying on one of the 5 bases that I've mentioned, you're going to have a very rigorous test applied, but everything else will be judged by rational basis review. So in the first place, you have to figure out the basis on which a law is classifying. Well, how do you start? Well, of course, you begin by looking at the law on its face. And sometimes you can answer the question right from there. You can determine, for example, whether a law is classifying on general economic or social bases, or whether it's classifying on one of the 5 bases that will trigger a heightened form of review. For example, if a law on its face said that men, but not women, could serve as administrators of estates, then clearly that would be a classification based upon gender, and the rules governing gender discrimination would apply. And that's a pretty easy kind of case. You just look at what the law actually says. But what if a law is neutral on its face? It doesn't mention any of the 5 bases that will trigger heightened review. It looks like an ordinary economic and social piece of legislation. How then do you determine on what basis it classifies? Do you simply look at the face of it? Or might you look somewhere else in addition? Well, you might look to see whether the law, although neutral on its face, is actually applied administratively with the bad purpose to discriminate on the basis of race, alienage, gender, etc. And if you discover that that's the case, then you will judge it as a discrimination on that basis. Take an example. There was a case, Yick Wo versus Hopkins, and Yik Wo and Wo Lee sued